My name is Mindy Romero, and I'm the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. And if you are with us here, you have signed up for a webinar entitled Threats to Voter Access in California, discussing the SAVE Act, executive orders, and voter ID laws. This webinar is part of a series that we've been putting on this past summer and spring called our CID Capital Briefing Series or Ledge Briefing Series. We do these series fairly regularly. We've done them over the years fairly regularly at the state capitol. Combination of in-person and webinar. Today, of course, is a webinar. This is the last in the series for this year. And we have tackled a lot of different topics, all really under the umbrella of kind of burning important issues related to the 2026 election cycle, and really designed to kind of address some of the, not just concerns, but some of the questions that we hear quite frequently kind of on the ground in the Sacramento and California communities. So hence the title of today's webinar, Threats to Voter Access in California. Clearly, this past year, this past number of years, but particularly right now, if you've been hearing the news, you're aware that there are a number of different types of potential threats, a lot of concerns. We're going to kind of cut through some of the, what's real and what isn't real, and really talk about some of the specific potential policy changes, laws, and so forth that are all kind of swirling around and hopefully help make sense of it for all of you. We've got an esteemed panel today to help us do that. We're very fortunate to have Ben Gibbs, who is the California policy advocate for Protect Democracy. Thanks, Ben. And Angelica Salceda from the ACLU, actually the program director from the ACLU Foundation of Northern California. Thank you, Angelica. And Marissa Lagos from KQED. She is the political correspondent and co-host of the Political Breakdown. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us. Because this is just a 1 hour webinar, and because we want to make this information short and digestible and accessible to everyone, I'm not going to go through detailed bios, but of course I refer everybody to bios that if you've registered, you have those already at hand. And in a moment, I'll also put them into the chat so you can take a look at the detailed bios and all of the experience and expertise that our panel brings today. So I am going to go ahead and jump in to our questions. This first question is for Marissa. Marissa, please set the stage for us in terms of the current public and media dialogue around this topic, threats to voter access in California. What are some of the concerns being expressed from voters, public officials, others about possible threats to voter access in this cycle? And this is a big topic, but if you can give us just an overview, kind of get everybody on the same page. Thank you.
Yeah. So, we've all lived through the last 6 years. So I think we know that the biggest kind of X factor in all of this is the president and what he's talking about and pushing for on the national level, and sort of questions about what he will do or not do ahead of this election. As most of the folks here probably already understand, but I think it bears repeating, the federal government does not run elections. States and counties do that. One of the great strengths of our system is how dispersed it is, how diverse it is, how many different actors play in it. And so I think, we've been doing a series on election integrity, really looking back through time and coming up to today. And I think, the most important thing to say is that we have very secure elections, despite a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing from the president. I think here in California, there's a couple challenges. One is the size, and we saw a lot of attacks coming from the president and others nationally at how long it takes to count votes here. That is both because of just the sheer size of California, 40 million people, over 20 million registered voters, but also because of the fact that we do almost have universal mail-in voting. We send ballots to everybody, not everybody takes advantage of that. But that means that a lot of the security checks that are done to ensure that one person is voting once are done on the back end. And so I thought it was really interesting, a lot of the sort of national rhetoric coming out of June when there was all these questions about like, oh, is this because of the fact that we allow ballots to arrive 7 days after? If you look at the numbers, that is actually not what slowed down the count largely. It is the just huge number of ballots that show up right before election day or on election day and that need to be checked to ensure that, the right people are voting. So I think just the rhetoric is important. If you say something enough times, people start believing it. We've seen that with a lot of the president's lies about, the integrity of our elections, everything from non-citizen voting, which is extremely rare, through, this question of like voter fraud more broadly, or people, voting more than once, all of these things. I think there are open questions because Trump has sort of toyed with the idea of, oh, should I be sending, troops to polling places? Will ICE be patrolling communities? I think that those threats are real, but probably less likely. First of all, there's just not. First of all, there's the legality to send military troops to polling places. The federal government really has no role other than observing when it comes to like the actual voting process. They may investigate it if there are problems, but they are not allowed to intervene. And then I think, if you just think of how large America is, there's not enough ICE agents to, go to every, voting place in the country. Could the president dissuade some people from voting or scare some people if there was sort of an uptick in raids and sensitive areas? Like, sure. I think all of these things would be challenged in court. So I think the bigger, what's amazing to me, and I'll be really interested to hear from Ben and Angelica as this conversation goes on, is like, I think there are real concerns, especially on the left, about the voter ID measure that's on the ballot right now in California. Obviously about the SAVE Act nationally, which is way more draconian and would have even, I think, deeper effects, although as I would argue almost dead on arrival. I don't think it can get out of the Senate. But, we struggle to get people out to vote in California, even with all of our very sort of progressive laws aimed at increasing voter access. Turnout here and participation here is not wildly different. In fact, sometimes it's lower than places like Georgia and Arizona that have more strict laws. So I think it's, I think one of the challenges we have that predates Trump is just getting people interested in feeling like their vote matters. And I don't think that has changed. In fact, I think it's gotten harder given all these attacks. So I think as we sit here in July, what I would say is like, I expect us to have free and fair elections in November. I'm sure there will be individual problems because there always are. But I think the bigger problem is sort of the distrust in the system. And I think that does a lot of harm. And regardless of whether Trump follows through on any of his threats, whether they're policy, military, whatever, that has really sort of seeped into our discourse and it has hurt us. And I'll note that even before that, we had a problem getting people out to vote. So I think that's my sort of 30,000 foot view, and we can obviously dig into a lot of those.
Thanks very much. And I should note that we will be having some time at the end for Q&A, and please use the webinar feature Q&A to submit your questions anywhere along our discussion today. All right, next question. And I'll first ask this of Angelica and then Ben. What is driving these conversations in California? How do they connect to the larger dialogue about threats and election interference? And I know Marissa touched on this as well, but I'd like to hear from both of you if we kind of let's dissect this out a little bit.
Yeah, and well, thank you for the invitation. It's certainly a pleasure, and I will preface my comments by saying that they will overlap with Marissa's comments. But I think the conversation here in California is really being driven by this national push, particularly from this federal administration, to erect more restrictive voting requirements, often justified by these like false claims of widespread voter impersonation. But as Marissa mentioned, the evidence simply does not support those claims. and in fact, decades of research, election administration experience, they've all consistently found that the type of fraud that those policies are aimed at preventing are just exceedingly rare. So we know that those proposals would really just create new hurdles for eligible voters. So I think what's happening at the national stage, again, is certainly informing the conversations that are happening here in California. And California, not just when it comes to these election or voting policies, but when it comes to the many policies that we're experiencing from the federal administration, California is often the focal point in this national debate. And that's because we have taken a very different approach. So rather than making it harder to participate, we've spent years expanding access to the ballot, and that has been in various forms. We've implemented reforms like automatic voter registration, universal vote by mail, same-day voter registration. We care a lot about our language access and expanding resources in election materials in various languages, and providing various opportunities for voters to be able to cast their ballots. Those policies have really been designed around a simple principle that I think really dominates the conversation here in California, which is that if you are eligible to vote, we should make it as easy as possible for you to participate. Now, obviously, that also goes to the problem that Marissa mentioned, which is like, I think we've been good about being able to do that. But our conversation and the conversation that we're having now is also sort of that additional step of like, how do we actually get folks to be able to then take that additional step and cast their ballots? I think as part of the conversation, it's important to recognize also that California just occupies a very unique place politically. We're the nation's largest voting jurisdictions. Our elections often have national implications. Historically, we've been home to some competitive congressional races. That continues to be the case. And when it comes to, issues of immigration, and again, any other policies that this federal administration is trying to ram through, California continues to lead many of the legal challenges in courts. So as a result, there's a lot of these discussions at the national level and policies that would really impact California. And so not only do we see ourselves in California as playing a very important role in pushing back, but we also recognize that we serve as a testing ground for some of these broader national efforts. And so I think it's just worth noting again that while we're seeing the federal administration retreating from policies that have historically expanded access to the ballot, California is moving in the opposite direction. Like that's the conversation that we're having here in this state. So rather than rolling back voting right protections, we're continuing to invest in making elections more accessible, more inclusive, more representative. And we're seeing that, in policies that advocates are trying to pass in the legislature of trying to codify into California law protections that people long ago assumed were guaranteed under federal law. But as we've seen federal voting rights protections eroded or weakened by court decisions, we've moved the conversation here in California of what we can do through our own legislative process, through codifying things in our own state laws to be able to continue protecting voters. And so I think, there's various conversations, and I think California is responding to that conversation in a very specific way.
Thank you. And Ben, before I let you answer that, I just want to let everybody know too, if they're not aware, we just about a week ago had a webinar as part of our national 2026 election series on the topic of the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act. So if that's of interest to viewers, which I assume it is, if you haven't seen it already, you can go to our website under previous events and you'll see the full recording as well as a highlights video. Ben.
Thank you, Mindy, and thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be a part of this panel today. I think, Marissa and Alika both added a lot of things that I really agree with. And I think there's a lot of different ways to describe what we're seeing. One of the things that we've found useful to describe it is thinking of it as efforts to deceive, disrupt, and deny legitimate election results are kind of what's driving the conversation here. What that means effectively is the president and others can sow doubt in elections in order to create a pretext to intervene if they don't like the results. That can play out in a lot of different ways, some of which Marisa and Angelica both mentioned, but I wanted to call out a few others just to kind of understand what I mean by those three words. On the deceive front, an example just recently was U.S. Attorney Assaili announcing that there would be investigations and claiming that charges would be filed in the June primary, all while ballots were still being counted. The election was ongoing. That's clearly just an effort to make people believe that there's something going on in the election when, at that stage, there would be no way for him to even make that claim with any certainty. And sure enough, he said he would be announcing those charges after certification. Here we are after certification, and nothing has emerged on that front. On the disrupt front, an example of kind of what we mean by that would be the executive order in March of this year from President Trump, which I know we'll talk about more, but targeting vote by mail systems that California uses, and trying to establish federal control over that, trying to sort of put a wrench in the gears of our systems, even if those efforts get struck down in the courts, as we're seeing, as we'll talk more about, claiming that there was an attempt to fix a process that didn't succeed can give more evidence that there are supposed problems with that process. And then finally, on the deny front, earlier this year, Speaker Mike Johnson just talking about the vote counting process in California and saying that it, quote, looks on its face to be fraudulent. He also went on to say, can I prove that? No, because it happened so far upstream, right? He's admitting that he has no evidence for these things, but he's sort of still just injecting enough pretext into the national conversation, such that if there's an effort to refuse to accept California's results in some way, that there would be sort of a groundwork for that. And Angelica touched on some of the reasons, politically and otherwise, why California is seeing special attention here. Having the most seats means that there are more places to deploy this type of attack. And so, I think that's one of the reasons. And then Marisa touched on, one of the other big pieces that is a little bit more specific to California, which is our timeline for calling races. One thing I do want to note on that is, if you look at the data, especially just from our election in June, we are seeing a lot of progress on that front. Both ballots being counted faster and races being called faster. That's clear, and that's really exciting. And also the governor and the legislature have shown a commitment to making that even better. And they allocated $40 million in this year's budget to elections, which mostly will go towards staffing and equipment in the counties, things that will be helpful. And just to, reiterate this, because it bears repeating, we know that the longer timelines are not a sign of flaws. They're a reflection of the commitment to making it easy and secure to cast your ballot that we have in California. A lot of the great and hard-fought and hard-won policies that Angelica mentioned as well, and not a problem in its own right, and really a reflection of a lot of the things that make California elections great. At the same time, there's plenty of research out there that shows that these longer timelines can open the doors for doubt in our elections. And, the longer people wait, the more sort of opportunity there is for these false narratives to take hold and to spread. And, I want to mention this too. And Marisa mentioned that, the longest sort of, the most time-consuming ballot for an election official to process is the one that arrives in an envelope on election day or just before election day. And, that is good news for everyone listening here today, because that means there's something you can do to, help be part of speeding up vote counting in California while still maintaining all of the things that make our elections great. And that's just getting your ballot in early or voting in person, voting in a way that doesn't contribute to that backlog. So, just to kind of wrap up, because we're big and because we are really careful and thoughtful in our ballot processing, we do have to be prepared for these baseless attacks. We know they're coming. They're already coming. But we do have to be ready to answer with the truth, which is that in California, voters have every reason to feel confident that their votes will be counted safely and securely.
Thanks. And Ben, while I have you there, let me ask you about the SAVE Act. So if you can, and then I'll ask Angelica also to chime in. Walk us through the SAVE Act and the president's, as well as the president's executive orders. And feel free if you want to split that up, the two of you. What are these things, right? That we've been hearing a lot about in the news, and certainly the president of the United States has been discussing them a lot. What is the current status of both? And what is the likelihood of access being threatened in California around, or from these two particular items specifically? What's really possible here? Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with a quick overview of the SAVE Act, and Angelica, I'll let you talk on the executive orders if that sounds good. To start with the SAVE Act, excuse me, since SAVE is in fact a slightly different thing. The SAVE Act would require documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. So that means most likely a passport or a birth certificate. And some versions of the law, including the one that passed the House, would require photo ID in order to vote, and would also give the federal government access to state voter lists. So, that's what it would do. In terms of why that is a problem, first of all, the entire motivation for this law is flawed. It's not solving a real problem. We know that non-citizen voting is already illegal, and it is also extremely rare. So despite there being no real need for this, the bill would effectively end online voter registration, vote by mail registration, and voter registration drives, which, if you look at all three of those methods of registering together, is how over 90% of Americans register to vote today. So it would really make it much, much harder to access the polls. And then there's also the fact that many folks don't have passports or may not have access to their birth certificates, or they may have a birth certificate that shows a different name, for example, if they got married and changed their name. So for all of those folks, this could create a real problem. The bill did pass the House in February, as I mentioned, but the good news is, and Marisa mentioned this at the top, it is blocked in the Senate. It pretty clearly doesn't have the votes, and all the procedural workarounds that have been tried to effectively ram it through have failed. So right now it looks like it's effectively dead, at least for this year, which is really good news. And as we talk about the executive orders, we'll talk more about the ways that they've been stopped in the courts as well. So really all of these efforts are unlikely to come to fruition in their original form. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean we can let our guard down. And I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but we do have to watch for things like this to appear in different forms. All three of these were really intended, under that sort of deceive, disrupt, deny framework to deceive and to manufacture reasons to doubt the results. And then also a little bit to disrupt by sort of letting the federal government change who gets to vote in some cases. So even though these are, blocked in Congress or getting blocked by the courts, it doesn't mean they're not achieving their goal of casting more doubt on our elections. That blocked order can turn into the courts wouldn't let us fix this, or the failure to pass the SAVE Act can turn into Congress wouldn't let us fix this. And we're already also seeing some of these same efforts come through with different tactics, like the sort of funding coercion tactic that we've seen of withholding DHS Homeland Security grants to states like California, which I believe there was just a lawsuit filed on today from the Attorney General that would try to stop this. But these are all aimed at the same goal. They may not be successful. The efforts to stop them in courts may be successful, but they still may sort of inject this doubt. So, part of what we can do in response to that is just see them for what they are. They're almost always doing the same thing, trying to cast doubt for no reason. And as long as we can sort of name that and see that clearly, that's already part of the defense to these moves.
Thank you. Angelica.
Before I go to the executive orders, maybe I'll just add a few more implications that we
Please.
could see, not just with the SAVE Act, but I know we'll be talking also about the California ballot initiative. But it's not just what Ben talked about, the difficulty of obtaining some of these documents, but even when you can obtain them, there's just like a lot of hidden costs that come with trying to get a document just to be able to register to vote or to vote. And it includes like taking time off work, arranging transportation, arranging childcare for those of us who have kids, paying the fees of replacement documents, and just navigating whatever government process that one would have to navigate to be able to get access to those documents. And that just adds these additional burdens that just make it really difficult to be able to participate when people are already navigating just the difficulties of life, or making ends meet. I think what we've also seen when we've been able to compare what has happened in other states, is that it ends up being on our election administrators to be able to implement some of these requirements, which is just an additional burden, and it complicates the system. It makes it so that eligible voters who would otherwise be eligible to vote might be incorrectly flagged or turned away if it's not clear that the document that they're providing is one that it would be sufficient enough. So I just wanted to add those additional pieces to how this could end up impacting, should some version of this end up impacting Californians. But when it comes to the executive orders, the executive orders that the president has issued have included like directing federal agencies to review issues related to voter registration, election funding, citizen verification. But I think just as in other contexts, executive orders, they can't amend federal election statutes or unilaterally override state election laws, where it's been very clear that Congress has delegated authority to the states. Obviously, that has not stopped the administration from issuing these executive orders, but as been alluded, several of the provisions of those orders are already being challenged in court, and not just with executive orders. But to give an example of an action that we're currently participating in, the U.S. DOJ sent letters to various secretaries of state, including here in California, asking for unredacted voter rolls. So, that's part of their plan to create a national voter roll. California resisted those efforts. DOJ challenged California. We are representing the League of Women Voters of California. We intervened in that case, and have made all the arguments that we've been able to make to be able to protect those voter rolls. Because when people register their vote, they're registering to vote, understanding that they're providing certain information specifically to be able to vote, and we understand that if we don't challenge those practices, then that also impacts whether people will feel like they can or want to register to vote if they feel like the federal government is going to have access to all sorts of sensitive and very personal information that people have provided, understanding that they're providing that specifically to be able to register to vote. I think for voters in California, I think in the immediate election cycle, one concern that I have is at least that because there's so many of these proposals out there with the sole purpose of just erecting barriers to election participation or to register or vote, it could discourage people from being able to participate. But I do think it's important, at least for now, to understand, the SAVE Act has not become law. And there's certainly still many opportunities for us, not just at the national level, but here in California, to really resist any efforts to make it harder to vote.
Thank you very much. All right. Hopefully, I'm okay in terms of my bandwidth. Let's talk about Proposition 39. And Helga just alluded to it, the voter ID proposition here in California. I'm going to ask Marissa to take this first and then Angelica again. Walk us through, of course, what it is. And we know it's a proposed state constitutional amendment requiring voter ID, but if you can talk a little bit more in detail, how does this amendment, how did it come about? What is the likelihood of passage? And what does it mean for access in the state, short term and long term, if it does indeed pass?
So this was put on by Republicans, led by Assembly Member Carl DeMaio and Republican Tony Strickland, both Southern California lawmakers. They collected the signatures and got this on the ballot. I will say it's far less sweeping than the SAVE Act. It essentially establishes a voter ID requirement, which, I think it's important to note. We do have a voter ID requirement when you register to vote. And most people are automatically registered through the DMV, which is who provides a lot of people their IDs. So I do think that's important to note. But this would say when you vote at the polls, you would have to choose an ID, your driver's license, social security number, birth, something that is basically accepted under this constitutional amendment. Or if you were voting by mail, you would have to put the last 4 digits of that ID on the ballot. And my understanding is you would have to pick one and stick with it. So you couldn't sort of one day put your social security and then when you vote, put your driver's license. It would also require election officials to annually report how many citizens or how many voters that they verified their citizenship. I have sort of outstanding questions about how that would work and what the actual goals are there. But, I think at its core, this is actually a pretty simple voter ID measure. It's not, the SAVE Act has been kind of outlined, had some really onerous requirements around like having a birth certificate and needing your documents to match what your current name is. So there's a lot of concerns with that one about like women who got married, changing their names, people who never have had access to something like a passport. I think this one is simpler, and I think that's why it's a very big concern to people who oppose these types of voter ID laws. I think this is a really interesting political question for Democrats and the left, is like how to handle something like this when a lot of polls show that voters don't have a big problem with something like this. Like they feel like we get asked for our ID all the time, which we do in many situations in life. And so I think like my two big political questions here are like, what is the case going to be made against this? I've been talking to folks this week who do oppose it, who have real big concerns about like not just like, does this, dissuade people from voting, result in fewer people coming out to the polls, but on the back end, like, what does this mean for registrars? How much extra work does this create in terms of this verification? Does this slow down the vote count even further? I mean, a lot of I've sort of been thinking about this, not just in context of this ballot measure, but, in context of some of these election denier movements we've seen in places like Shasta County. A lot of the things that folks are demanding be put in place ostensibly to make things more secure actually make it a lot harder for registrars to do their jobs and make the count slower. So I think that is going to be something I'll be watching to see if that even becomes part of this conversation. And I think, like, again, just on the politics here, part of the problem for the opposition is a lot of the groups that might be sort of natural fits to help fund and run a campaign against this measure are pretty tied up with other things this cycle, right? Obviously, you have the House races that are incredibly important to both parties nationally, but then you also have the billionaire tax. You have, the Teachers Association and others trying to extend high income taxes on higher earners for another 6 years or whatever. So my question at this point is like, who is going to run the opposition campaign? I think for Republicans, this is kind of like a win no matter what, because if it wins, then they have been able to convince voters in one of the most liberal states in the nation that they should enact voter ID. And if they lose, then they get to point to California and say how crazy we are. So I think the politics of this are a lot more complicated than the actual measure itself.
One interesting thing about this, and we've seen some recent polling, it really is like how you end up describing where this measure is coming from. And, I have faith in the voters to recognize this for what it is, which is an attempt to like continue erecting barriers um, aligned with what this federal administration wants to do. And when you ask voters and you frame it in that way, they feel very differently about this and have strong concerns about a measure like this. So the polling on this has been very interesting, and we've seen it shift throughout times of like, when it was first being circulated, and then with this voter initiative being really framed within the national context, which is like the context that we live in of everything that the administration is trying to do. I think when it comes to this measure, a few things that I often think about also that it's important for voters to think about when they're considering is that, yes, they will have to end up putting some form of ID. If that's someone's social security number, that creates some privacy risk if you're having to put 4 digits of, the last 4 digits of your social security number, whatever number that you identify on election materials. That creates a paper trail. I don't know many people that would feel comfortable putting some identifying number that is like linked to them on that. It would also make it easier to just create an error, like to remember what is the number that you ended up using to register. And so now we have to not just make sure that we remember to sign using the signature that is on our registration, to date, to seal, and then to end up adding those additional numbers, because otherwise, like all of that will then mean that we have to correct it. And, many of us live very busy lives, and it might make it really hard then to be able to have your ballot casted if you're making mistakes. I think to Marissa's point, I don't have any doubt that it would create longer lines and delays at the polls. Like if you're having to add an additional ID check, that's going to slow down the process. It's also going to cause some delays similar to the ones that I alluded of, like questions of whether a document that someone is presenting is, within the list of like eligible documents to be able to show that you can vote. We've mentioned this before, but certainly there's going to be barriers to other people who, may want. I forget my bag all the time. I have 3 kids, and like one day, like sometimes I get the diaper bag, some days I get like the sports bag, and like maybe my wallet is in it. But if I end up going to the poll and I have to like, I have a million other things to do, like what is the likelihood that I might return if I forgot my ID? I mean, I don't know. I probably, maybe I would, but like how many other people would? And I think it just ends up really putting the burden and making it even harder for our election administrators to be able to have to do all this and administer the long lines already, and then figure out this whole process. I'm hopeful again that voters will see this for what it is and will oppose it. But I also have no doubt that I think in this national context, we're going to continue seeing proposals similar to this, not just in California, nationally and
Thank you. So framing matters. That's one of the things I heard you saying, Hanneke. All right. So what are state, and this is for Marissa here, and I'm going to ask you about election officials and what are state and local election officials doing to address or prevent these threats? Typically, when we're talking about topics like this, I make sure that we have an election official on the panel. We will be talking about election interference efforts, potential efforts nationally at our August 5th webinar, and that conversation will actually be with the former EAC chair, Tom Hicks. So I want to just make sure I highlight that to folks. So we don't have an election official with us today, but Marissa, if you can tackle, as you understand it, what election officials are doing on this topic. Thank you.
I mean, I think they're doing what they always do, which is their jobs, right? I mean, we do have, as I said before, a really secure and safe election system. It is run, depending on your county, by Democrats, Republicans, independents. I think one of the sort of hallmarks that's most upsetting of the last 6 years is how much these are the people on the front lines who have become kind of the focus of a lot of the abuse and conspiracy theories and threats. And it's affected their ability to do their job, right? I mean, why would you want to go be a government worker and, probably not make as much as you might be able to do in the private sector if you are going to be like threatened by people in your community and just have to deal with this type of abuse. So I guess I would just start by saying like props to all the workers because I think they're still doing a great job. We just had this week the new registrar that was elected in Shasta County, which, as I said, has been a hotbed a lot of this. I think in places like that where you have had a lot of this election denialism, there's been a real effort, and even in places where just that have been, the brunt of sort of Trump's attacks, like what we saw in Los Angeles this year, election officials to be as transparent as possible, to advocate for resources. I mean, I do think that's one thing that I'm sort of surprised we haven't seen more of out of the state legislature is more support for local elections offices financially. We've asked them to do a lot over the past decade, really ever since COVID, when we went to all mail-in voting. And I think that resources like just like physical space, like you talk to registrars in smaller counties, like they just literally don't have the room to store all the ballots or to do the counting work. So I think there's some like real just like infrastructure, like nitty gritty things that Democrats, Republicans could join forces on and make happen. Honestly, in California, they don't even need Republicans. They could just do it with Democrats up in Sacramento. But this is where we get back to how much of the conversation is just unhinged from the reality on the ground. You have even these smaller counties counting more ballots and sometimes counting them more quickly than they ever have before. And so I think, I think what we're seeing, and I was noticing before we got on here that there's a new lawsuit the state just filed with, I think, 13 or 14 other states, challenging, the Trump administration has again and again tried to leverage funding that has nothing to do with one area to force states and localities into changing policies in another. So I'm thinking about, trying to restrict funds for, police and firefighters because, we support trans people in San Francisco. I mean, really just like not connected at all. The lawsuit today is pretty specific, essentially saying that they are trying to cut public safety funding for things like training first responders, strengthening cyber security, preparing for potential terrorist attacks. If, basically the Trump administration is saying, if you don't adopt our election policies, including sharing your voter rolls with us, verifying voter citizenship through our system, participating in immigration enforcement, right, which again has nothing to do with this. So these are the types of lawsuits that I think the local county officials are really depending on the state to lead. And I think, that it makes sense that California is filing that suit, not 58 individual counties. So yeah, I think thank your election workers when you see them, I would say. And just keep in mind, I mean, that there are things like we can all do as individuals. And again, I've sort of been surprised we haven't heard more messaging from Newsom and others on this. Like, it's helpful if you turn in your ballot a week ahead of time. Like, if you don't wait till the last minute, that will actually speed up the process and make it easier for your local registrar. So I do think like things like that, just thinking about our own behavior is helpful. Obviously, not everyone's going to change. And, voting is an easier proposition for some folks than others. But I think there are things we can do to kind of lighten the load a little.
Thank you.
Mindy, can I jump in on this question as well? Do you mind?
Sure, go for it.
Thank you so much. I'll be quick. I just wanted to, emphasize one thing in response to this that Marissa mentioned at the top of the conversation here, but I think is important to mention here, which is just that, part of why these executive orders are getting struck down, for example, and why this lawsuit is likely to succeed that was filed today is because the states and localities run our elections, and the federal role is really narrow. It's a supportive role, or meant to be a supportive role, I should say. And, the law is on the side of state and local election officials all the way, up to the U.S. Constitution. So, that is part of why things are playing out the way they are. And another thing I wanted to mention on this question is that we really are seeing election officials in California and around the country preparing for the various types of threats we've discussed today. Protect Democracy, along with the Brennan Center, put out a guide for election officials that we've shared with a lot of election officials here in California that has really concrete things like meeting with your lawyers to prepare for legal responses, training your team on different scenarios that might occur, and setting up plans for misinformation campaigns. And we're seeing election officials in California really taking those steps, which is great. Another place we're seeing a lot of action from election officials, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is on the sort of responding to these claims, that these attacks on public trust, especially through efforts to produce timely election results. And Bob Page had an important clarification on this in the chat, or in the Q&A, I should say, that I wanted to make sure
Thanks, Ben.
to read out. So thank you for that, Bob. We may not have an election official on the panel, but really appreciate you chiming in there, which is, that when we think about timely election results in California, most of us are thinking about when media outlets call the races, and that is a fundamentally different thing from when an election is certified. In California, that is set by statute rather than when all the ballots are counted. And I said earlier that the data shows we're really improving on, speed of counting ballots, and that's looking at sort of the percentage of ballots remaining to be counted a given number of days after the election. And in talking with the decision desks who do make those projections from the media outlets, that is unsurprisingly one of the big things that shapes when races can be called, which again is sort of one of the things that we know really does shape trust in elections. So it's an important piece of the puzzle when we're seeing those attacks. So a lot of other innovative things I can talk more about if we have time, related to like Sign, Scan, and Go voting, which has been really successful in places like Placer County and Nevada County, or different voter outreach strategies that we've seen. But really, all of these are just even more reasons why voters can and should feel really confident that their votes are going to be counted safely and securely.
Thanks, Ben. And yes, I should note, we do have Bob Page, Orange County Registrar, very respected in the state and throughout the country as a leading registrar, and he is providing some kind clarification and some good notes. So if you haven't seen the chat, I'm saying this to our viewers, please check it out. All right. And one thing we should say too, if folks want to hear more about what their election officials are doing, they can find them on social media. They can engage with the office. Many of our registrars across California and across the country, like Bob, are very interactive with those that they serve, or on social media, putting out videos, doing educational meetings and events. So go to your source, right? Your local source. Next question. Let's talk about community and mobilizing efforts. So what are they doing, in this conversation around potential threats, both in terms of maybe hitting them head on, but also just educating folks and making people aware, or countering some of the messaging, but also beyond that, as community groups. Marissa, you mentioned at the outset that a lot of groups that would be involved in this type of conversation are also busy doing other things. So Angelica and Ben, walk us through what this looks like for community organizing efforts. How are they involved? And also in their normal kind of get out the vote effort, or in community engagement work that they're doing, how does all of this kind of impact? How are they navigating it? And Ben, if you want to go first, please do.
Sure. I'll try to keep this really brief since I jumped in on the last one. as I said, I think the biggest thing that any individual Californian can do to, be part of the solution to, responding to these baseless attacks is to vote early or vote in person. Make sure that you are, part of that first batch of ballots or of results that can be released on election night. And we are seeing a lot of interest from community groups around the state and helping encourage members of their groups to make their voices heard as early as they feel comfortable doing. That's been really exciting to see. Just to sort of explain a little bit quickly why that matters, which I think, Marisa already touched on, but, there are a lot of steps that have to happen if your ballot is part of that group that comes in on election day or shortly after, and it is in an envelope. It has to be signature verified. It has to be removed from the envelope. It has to be scanned, sometimes multiple times. There really are great options for, making sure that you can still vote while, not being part of that glut of ballots that arrives just before election day or on election day. There are other great things that we're seeing community groups really try to do in that same realm of building trust. And Mindy, you were just referencing some of these, but, going and reaching out to your elections official in your county and seeing if you can tour the elections office with some friends or some members of a group that you're a part of, learning about the process, kind of understanding it better, and then whether you've done that or whether you've learned in other ways, talking with your friends and neighbors, making sure that folks understand the system, understand the checks that are in place to keep things safe and secure, seeing what questions folks have and trying to find answers to them. There's also obviously always the great option of volunteering to be a poll worker, which you can learn so much about the process that way. So there's a lot of ways to be part of the solution to these attacks and to push back on them. And we're seeing a lot of community groups really embracing those, which is fantastic.
I think the only thing I would add is that, we're doing a lot of the traditional things, but also updating it to be reflective to our current environment. So many of our organizations, will distribute Know Your Rights information, but now we're including information of like the potential scenarios, what to do if there is ice at the polls, because people are still thinking about that. Those are still questions on top of people's minds. I think the same is true when it comes to the organizations who do the election protection work, who do the poll monitoring. And the poll monitoring is so important from, organization, our friends at like Common Cause, Asian Law Caucus, who really lead a lot of this work. They're also answering questions from voters of, I'm also thinking about our friends at, Disability Rights California. They get so many calls from individuals who want to be able to vote on that day and just have additional like access needs. And so I think a lot of the community groups and organizations are doing the work that they've always been doing, but also responding to the moment by updating and making sure that they are providing the answers or the resources to questions that are top of mind, whether it is likely that they might happen or not. And I think for organizations like the ACLU, we're constantly preparing to challenge policies or any of these potential scenarios. And I think being that resource for our communities and our organizations is really important. Again, whether or not these scenarios might actually become true or not, it is important to at least be prepared. And I think that's how we're meeting.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and move over to the Q&A. Who or what department would actually step in if the feds, as it's phrased here, show up at polls or where the vote counting is happening?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges, right? Is that, and we saw this with the takeover of the National Guard and what happened in LA with the ICE protest, which is, I think that there is the potential for real disruption if that were to happen. I think lawsuits would immediately be filed by both local and state officials and probably outside groups like the folks we're talking to. I think that there would obviously be a ton of media coverage, but is there like, a state agency that's going to physically stand in the way of ICE agents? Like, likely not. Again, I think part of what, sort of quote unquote protects us is the sheer size of the nation and how like difficult it would be logistically to try to actually disrupt this stuff. But I mean, this is something I've thought about because we have seen in the past, I mean, thinking back, that this is a different sort of analogy, but like thinking back to races like the 2000 presidential race when votes just the Supreme Court ordered votes to stop being recounted in Florida, or thinking back to, I think it was Missouri or in the same election where there had been some conflict over poll locations being changed and moved and whether people actually had access. Courts have at times refused to extend polling hours and things like that. So these things would play out like in real time in the courts. Like this wouldn't be like, oh, we'll schedule something for 2 weeks down the line. But I think that's certainly something that, our governor and others are thinking about and trying to sort of like head off, because obviously the best situation is just like that doesn't happen at all. And that there's a sense that there's not a sort of political or public benefit, in fact, that it could be harmful to the Trump administration to doing this. So I think the pressure is almost as important ahead of this.
And just to add one note on that, I mean, I think I completely agree with everything that Marisa said. I think, part of the reality of, knowing that those things would immediately go to court and that they would immediately, likely be decided that is illegal, because the law is not vague on this, right? It would be clearly illegal to have uniformed armed federal officials at a voting location. No one wants to do something like that is patently illegal. There are still consequences for that, both including personal liability in some cases, right? So that's part of why we don't think that those scenarios are as likely, is just because there's really no doubt or uncertainty in the legality of them, or the illegality of them, I should say.
Well, this is a quick, easy one. Any guesstimates on how much Prop 39 will cost as a ballot measure?
Let me look it up. I can look it up literally right now. So give me a second, then maybe we can take another question and come.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. This is the benefit to having a reporter on. As many more California counties are now dependent on the USPS doing heavy lifting on the high percentages of mail-ins, where do you foresee the biggest hiccups come on election day?
I mean, I think we've already seen some of this in California when it comes to rural counties. And I say that as someone who also lives in a rural community. And with some of the changes that the postmark be done at a regional center means that if you're mailing it from Merced, that it would have to get to Fresno to be able to get postmarked. So that's going to cause delays. And I think it's important to be able to communicate that to voters, so voters understand that, putting it in the ballot, dropping it off might still mean that there might be a few days of delay to getting a postmarked, and that's just going to have huge implications as part of the.
I do have. Sorry, I have an answer on the other one if we want to just quickly. The nonpartisan legislative analyst says it could be tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars each year to both state and local governments. And they note that there could be some savings if fewer people are registered to vote. But obviously that's problematic for other reasons. And it wouldn't by no means make up for the increased cost. The exact cost they're saying would depend on some of the way it's written allows the legislature, as Bob noted, to make some decisions about things. And so that would.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add on one thought to Angelica's answer on the, USPS delays. I'm with you, Angelica, in a more rural county. I'm here in El Dorado County, and I think more and more folks that I'm talking to here are starting to understand the difference between putting your ballot in a mailbox versus a drop box, and all of the many benefits that using a drop box offers. I think it's the kind of voter education thing that doesn't take place overnight, but I think over the last few elections, people are starting to understand that better. So I think that's going to be a big part of the solution for how counties can respond to these USPS challenges, and is making drop boxes as accessible as possible and making sure that they're available in as many places as they can be.
All right, thank you all very much. So we are at time. I think we got to most of the questions. If there's anything burning out there that we haven't addressed, feel free to go ahead and email me directly, and we'll try to get you an answer from one or more of our panelists, or I'll answer it myself as well, potentially. I want to thank all the viewers today. Again, we're going to we are recording this. We're going to be sending it out. We encourage everyone to view it again if you'd like, but certainly to share it through your networks. And before I go, I so again want to thank Ben Gibbs Angelica Salceda, and of course, Marissa Lagos. Very fortunate to have all three of you on this panel today. Thank you for your thoughts, your wisdom. And lastly, I want to thank our partner in this series. Today is the last, I said, of our Capital Speaker Series. The Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund has been a great partner throughout all of the series that we've had around the election in California. So thank you very much. And all of you have a great rest of the day. Thank you again to our panel.